And together, we will move mountains. And if they don't hear our message, then we'll just do it over and over and over and over 1,000 times again for you.
And I'll rise up, I'll rise like the day, I'll rise up in spite of you. I will rise, we will rise, we will rise, we will rise up.
Hello, everyone. My name is Michelle Zabel, and my pronouns are she and her. I'm an assistant dean at the University of Maryland, Baltimore, director of the Institute for Innovation and Implementation, and I'm here to welcome you to the 2021 Training Institute live series. Although I know we would all love to be together in person, I am still so thrilled to welcome you virtually to the kickoff of this premier convening of leaders in children's services. Today's keynote, followed by 2 concurrent workshops, begin the 9-month-long Virtual Training Institute live series. So instead of us all being on one all too short week of conference sessions, we've spread this out over the first Thursday of every month through August. So 9 months of wonderfully engaging content. And we hope you'll be back every month. And we hope you'll share this opportunity with all your colleagues. So what could be? Bolder systems and brighter futures for children, youth, young adults, and their families. When we were planning this conference and thinking about what and why we wanted to organize around this theme, all pre-pandemic, of course, we certainly understood the opportunities for improvements in our field. But I think as all of us can attest, what we know today, how we understand what we know, and what we envision for our future, it's just so much deeper. In the past year, we've been challenged by a global health pandemic. We've been part of an impassioned call to end endemic racism. And this past year has laid bare all that's wrong with our current systems, how deeply people and communities are hurting. Although we have risen to the occasion, and we've done our best to meet these challenges. We've developed new ideas and approaches. We're innovating, we're pivoting. We still just have so much more to do to ensure that we are consistently elevating the voices of children, youth, and families and the communities they live in, especially those voices who are most frequently silenced or marginalized. We just must continue to promote information that uses the best data and research available in service of our commitment to social justice and to the creation of a more equitable world. We must now more than ever be bold. Training Institutes Live are designed to challenge the way we have always done things, build on what we truly know, integrate all that we've learned in the past year, and help us all make just, fair, and informed decisions that promote the creation of brighter futures for youth and their families. So as we get started, I want to take a few minutes and thank the Institute staff and the faculty who've worked so hard to make this series a success. Most especially our Director of Events, Salika Woods, who in this time of COVID has become a master of virtual events. Marlene Matarese, who's my partner in crime and our Institute's Deputy Director, as well as Michelle Boardman and Meredith Gunn and their amazingly talented marketing and instructional design and media teams. And in particular, I want to stop and thank Bestrel, who has poured hours and hours into crafting and negotiating 9 months of wonderful workshops for you. Her guidance and leadership at the Institute is always deeply appreciated. So before I introduce our keynote speaker, I have the exciting opportunity to remind you of some general housekeeping items. And even in a virtual world, I can't seem to get rid of this part. So I do want to remind everybody that our workshops are being recorded, and so your participation implies consent. Also, please remember, if at any time you need help in navigating through a virtual space or accessing links to workshops, We have a live help desk chat that's being monitored during the duration of everything. And so our team is posting the link to connect with the live help desk in the chat box. During all the workshops being offered throughout the series, I want to encourage you to actively participate by using the chat to post your questions, your comments, any resources you want to share with your fellow participants. Our presenters absolutely want to hear from you, and we know your participation will make the workshops all that much better. We have staff monitoring the chat in Zoom and on YouTube, and they will assist with facilitating your questions and also make sure the presenters' resources are shared with you. Following the keynote, you'll be able to take a brief intermission and join us for some wellness and mindfulness activities before beginning one of the workshops. And then finally, there will be an ASL interpreter or closed caption available throughout all workshops. Interpreters will show on your screen, and they can be pinned if you require interpretation. You hover over their video, and by selecting the three dots, one of those options that will appear is pin video. So by selecting pin the video, this video won't move out of you for you. Okay, housekeeping's taken care of, and now I want to turn our attention to the business at hand. Today, I am really thrilled to have a keynote speaker who is skilled at analyzing what works and what needs innovating in the ways that we should be supporting youth and families. Dr. Amelia Franck Meyer is the founder and CEO of Alia Innovations. Amelia and Team Alia are building a proof of concept that public child welfare agencies working with other systems, their communities, and the families they serve can become primary prevention agencies that build new ways to work to keep children safely with their families, not from their families. To achieve this goal, Amelia and her team specialize in workforce well-being, leadership development, coaching, systems change work geared toward eliminating the need for foster care, all with a strong commitment to anti-racism. So Amelia has a highly accoladed 30-year career with numerous awards, fellowships, certificates, a highly viewed TED Talk. But for me, what I think is most important, along with all those accolades, is that Amelia knows, just like you do, this work can't be done alone. It can't be done in isolation, that family voices are the solution, and that all of us working together can create a world in which all children and their caregivers can thrive. So I want to thank you again for joining us. Amelia, I just truly appreciate you being here, and I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you, Michelle. It's so exciting to be here, and I appreciate the opportunity to kick things off here and to be with you today. So I love the title of Bolder Systems and Brighter Futures. And I think those of us who have worked in the field for any amount of time know that we are ready for bolder systems. The question really becomes a little bit of how. And so I'm going to talk today about some ideas of how to get to those bolder systems and brighter futures. So I appreciate the introduction, Michelle. I'll just say a minute about the team that I work with. We are, Alia is a nonprofit based in St. Paul, but we work all over the country and in Canada, working with people who are interested in doing systems change related to child welfare. And I wanted to open up really asking you a question about that. And I encourage you to use the chat to do this. But if you could change one thing about the child welfare system, what might that be? What would that be? And to just really think through the idea of what is at the forefront of your mind when you think about what is it that needs to change. I think there's a pretty strong consensus that it needs to change, but what needs to change is the question that I'm asking here today. So if you could take a second and put some of those in the chat, that would be really an interesting thing for me to see. So some of what I'm seeing here is broaden boundaries of what help looks like, maintain a high bar for children and their families, to increase the resources in housing, for sure, equity in the system, more support to families, lower caseloads, strengthening our system. Kelly, I love you bringing in empathy as well. That's something else we'll talk about here in a little bit. Really leaning into talking with our families and bringing them in as equal partners in our work, and attending to the need for resources, biological and adaptive. So many great ideas here. More upstream, more prevention, more natural supports, better analysis of what families need, right? These are great ideas, and they all will come into play as we talk about what kinds of things need to change and are changing. I'm really encouraged actually by your chat answers. I would say 5 years ago, the keynotes I got asked to present were largely around convincing people that the system needed to change, really convincing people that there was a need to do things differently. And in the last probably year and a half to 2 years, I have personally seen around the country and in systems we work in and in environments in which I'm in, that there is a collective mindset shift, that in our field, we are moving away from admiring the problem of what child welfare is, and instead really talking about how do we build solutions. So there is some gained momentum around the idea that we need to change. And so that's for me very encouraging, and your chat reflects that. It reflects some of the things that we're seeing related to the answers to how might we change. So I do want to start a little bit in the beginning here on kind of a philosophical or framework base that is very important to me, and it's Meg Wheatley's work around systems change. And I think if we understand this framework, it helps to really think about what needs to happen next. So as you can see, you know, the current system follows an evolution of a system. So the diagram I'm putting in front of you really can apply to virtually any system. It can apply to, say, for example, our democracy. It can apply to the education system. It can apply to a lot of systems. And so we're thinking about it now in terms of the child welfare system. And what we know is that all systems are really born or started on a beginning set of assumptions. People come together, they say, there's a challenge here that we need to come together collectively to address. They begin to build the makings of a system. And then as the system matures, right, as we get to the top of the system, it becomes everyone's job in the system, subconsciously, to protect the status quo. So what we see is that all of the funding streams protect the status quo. All of the job roles and titles protect status quo. All of the policies and laws and rules and structures and systems line up to keep what is as it is. And eventually, the system starts to decline and fail because we know more than we did when we started it. And we've tried things we never tried before. And we are learning about what the system is capable of and what the unintended consequences are. And eventually, as the system begins to fail, it needs to be put into an intentional hospice because it's outliving its initial usefulness and needs adjustment. What tends to happen then, Margaret Wheatley would say, is that innovators and trailblazers and pioneers begin to pop up and say, I've got an idea of how to fix it, or I have a model. And a lot of folks start to pop up to say, this is what we need to keep the system in place. And according to her theory, what is true is that until those people begin to work together to develop a collective mindset about how we would do this in a new way, nothing really changes. There's just a lot of individual actors or individual models. And it's why on the front lines, we have folks who are trained or certified in 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 models, but they're not really sure how to bring those together when they're sitting in front of families and children. and we don't really have a larger systemic framework of change that drives all of us in a different direction. And so really what I'm interested in is, how do we build this new way together? What is the new way of work? And once we can come to an agreement on what that new way is, you'll see the transition of resources and people and parts of the system that we have now will move into a new shared mindset of a new way of work. And I will say, I am not convinced that it is a new system. I'm not really sure. It's just a parallel kind of system that's a little different. I wonder if there might be things that we can do that really obsolete the need for a large public system in the work that we do. And I'll talk more about that in a little bit. But something else very important to point out before I move on from this kind of foundational slide here is that all systems begin on a beginning set of assumptions. And if we're going to build a new way together, it's really important that we understand the assumptions. And the assumptions that the child welfare system were set upon were that some children would be better off with other families than they would be with their own. Historically, we know that that was often Black, Brown, or Indigenous children would be better off with whiter families. It might have meant that poorer children might be better off with wealthier families who could, and I'm putting this in air quotes, give them a better life. And so we really have to come to examine these assumptions. We know more now about attachment and the importance of being with one's family and the sense of identity. And we understand better the lifelong predictive harm of being removed from your family. And so this is really the framework in which I will build the next piece of work here. So as in terms of evidence, we started to build evidence to say, do we really need to change? And from every angle we looked at, the answer is yes. We've commissioned a social return on investment study, which is part of the resources shared as part of the conference or on our website, which says, of the $29.9 billion a year we invest in child welfare in this country, that for every dollar we invest, when we do it really well, we lose $3.64. And for every dollar we invest, when we do the work the way it is more typically done, we lose $9.55. So even if you don't care about children or families, which I don't know anybody who doesn't, but even if you were saying, we couldn't afford to make the change, if you looked at the social return, you'd say, we have to make the change. We really can't afford not to. The financial cost of continuing our present way of work is unsustainable. We've also commissioned a research brief to look at, what do we know from the research about removing children? And what is the case against family separation? And in a literature review, again, this resource is available to you after conference, it was found that for children who have experienced maltreatment, so I just want to pause there for a second, because it's children who have experienced maltreatment. Out-of-home placement provides little to no measurable benefit in terms of their cognitive, language outcomes, academic achievement, mental health or behavioral health, or suicide risk. And so we can't come up with really great reasons to continue to separate families. And we have very little evidence for our current way of work. Very little evidence. If you talk to youth who have lived through the system or families who have been separated, if you look at the longitudinal outcomes in the Midwest studies, if you look at the social return on investment, if you look at the academic literature, you will be hard pressed to find an argument to continue our present way of work in child welfare. And so that brings us to, what else do we do? And really this idea that we have to do things very differently, not just a little bit better. So this quote was shared from a public child welfare leader who I have a lot of respect for, and it's one of my favorites. It says, "The electric light did not come from the continuous improvement of candles." Another one I've heard is, Henry Ford did not build the automobile by breeding faster horses, that we have to do something very different. And it's really important that we start talking about what is the different we want to do. Are we trying to reduce the number of children in living in out-of-home care or foster care? Or are we trying to obsolete the need for foster care, to strengthen families and communities in such a way that it wouldn't be necessary to support or to separate families? What are we really trying to prevent when we say prevention? Or what are we really trying to do to improve the system? And making changes so that it is better is really not working. We work with systems all over the country who are premier systems doing the work in the way it has been designed to be done. And to quote one of the leaders, I don't think I can use this word here, but I'll substitute one. You know, it still is terrible. Even when they do it the best way it can be done, the experience for children and families, the lifelong predictive harm is still unacceptable. So then we start to think about how might we look at these problems differently, right? And I tend to believe that we are solving some of the wrong problems. And so often when I am in systems and I ask some of their bigger problems, I usually hear that they don't have enough foster parents. They don't have enough resource parents. They don't have enough adoptive parents. And so solving that problem is very different than solving the problem in a different way. So if we say, is the problem that we don't have enough resource parents, or is the problem that too many children cannot live safely at home? So one is a supply problem, not enough resource parents. One is curbing demand, which is to say, if children could live safely at home, if we help families to safely parent, we wouldn't need resource families, and that would solve that problem. So what I see in systems is over and over, the problems we're trying to solve are really of our own making, and they're really around the framing of the problem in a different way. I'll give you one more example here as a way to kind of, you know, look at things in a different light or look at things in a different direction. I live in Minnesota, and one of the county attorneys wanted to address the problem of sex trafficking in his county. And he could have really gone and arrested folks who were working in that area. But instead, what he did is placed officers in alleys known for trafficking, took pictures of the license plates, and sent those pictures in a letter to the female heads of households and said, your car was seen at 2:30 in the morning in an alley in an area known for trafficking. And so what he did was try to go after demand instead of supply in that kind of problem solving. So we all have to be thinking with different hats on in different ways for different solutions about the problems we're trying to solve, and to be sure that we are solving root cause problems, that we are looking at problems in new ways. One of my favorite innovators says something about this, Buckminster Fuller. He says, you never change things by fighting the existing reality. To change something, build a new model that makes the existing model obsolete. And so I'm really interested in this idea of how do we obsolete the need to separate families? How do we obsolete the need to have foster care, to place children in homes of people who they are not related to and who are unknown to them? How do we stop the need for that? And that requires looking at the problems in a new way. And I'll give you an example of that. Some of you may remember this place, Blockbuster, or maybe you had Family Video where you lived. And I want you to think about what Buckminster Fuller said about you don't solve things by fighting the existing way, you build a new way that makes it so you don't need the old way. So we did not protest in front of Blockbuster or Family Video. We weren't out carrying signs saying, I will not be kind, I refuse to rewind. You know, we didn't protest them. Instead, something else happened, right? Go back to the Wayback Machine and think about what else happened for you. Anybody remember what that was? What happened was Redbox and then Netflix. And you did not have to go out into the world in the snow where I live or get out of your pajamas. They were never out of the movie. It's still a modern day miracle to me how they never run out of movies. And, we didn't have to fight over which one to get. And so it quickly took over and these places disappeared what seemed like overnight. And so they built a new way, a faster, easier way. I gladly at the time paid my $9.99 a month to mail DVDs back and forth to Netflix. So what's the equivalent for us? What way could we build that would obsolete the need to separate families? What instead might we find as a solution? So we knew we weren't going to come up with this answer all by ourselves. And so in 2017, we gathered 100 innovators from around the country and worked with the human-centered design firm out of Stanford D School out of San Francisco, IDEO, and used an approach called human-centered design. And in human-centered design, what you do first is build empathy. So you really work very closely with people who are experiencing challenges to learn about how that challenge is impacting their life and what solutions they might have in order to improve things. So this was 4 years ago, and we've evolved since then, which I'll talk about in a little bit. But really what happened as a result of this event with these 100 innovators is that, and I should mention, about a third of the folks who were designing had lived experience in the system, either losing children or growing up in the system, and about half of the folks came from underrepresented communities. And what we came up with was 30 different prototypes of different ways of doing child welfare. And in the end, as we looked at them all and said, what are they all saying? We got a very important reminder. And what they said to us when we asked, how might we build a better child welfare system, is that the perfect child welfare system already exists. And it's called the family. And we don't need to build a different system to really replicate what the family brings. A public system is not going to do that. Instead, we should have asked a different question. We should have asked, after 4 days of bringing 100 people together from around the country, realized we had asked the wrong question. The question should have been, when families struggle, as they do, as yours does, and as mine does, what do we do then? What do we do then to keep families safely together? What do we do then to ensure that children can have an uninterrupted sense of belonging? What might we do then? And the answer that we pulled together was to think about this as a concept, a framework. And we called that framework an unsystem. So it's not the unsystem, it's not a model. And we know this new way of work might be called, I've heard it called the family strengthening system, the family well-being system. I don't know what it'll be called in the future. Maybe it'll just be called family. But in the meantime, we know it's not this system. And so we are moving away from a system that undermines family bonds and that blames and shames and punishes and disconnects families, to one instead that builds families' capacity to safely parent, that allows children to stay safely with, not from their families, by using natural supports and valuing relational connections and family ties, by looking at locally delivered resources, by having supportive, consistent connections that are culturally specific and supportive, and that focuses on building resilience and joy and well-being and health. The guiding principles of an unsystem, so that we know if we're there or not, are these. And these really drive a lot of the work we do in transformation and systems. Number one, protect relational connections as sacred. We treat it as the nuclear option because it has fallout to not just the children, but we're learning more and more about, the risk of death by suicide of moms who have had their kids removed, the impact on the whole family and community. And we talk about nurturing the capacity for joy. And this is not just, you know, the idea that children should have fun. It's the idea that all humans need joy, and joy is actually a sign of safety. You don't laugh with people you don't feel safe with. And so us helping families should not destroy our own families or our own capacity to be good parents and partners or our own well-being, that there should be an element of when we are supporting people in equitable ways, it should be a joyful experience. Insisting on racial equity and radical inclusion and undoing the colonization and the systemic tools that have been used to separate families as a tool of racial oppression, daring to share power with our families and with one another. We know for sure we're not going to get this done alone. The problems that we have facing us are too large and too complex for any person or organization to solve alone. We have to come together. Committing to intergenerational well-being, so it's not just children we're working with, but really supporting their parents and their larger family to be able to safely parent. Trusting the wisdom of children and families to design their own futures in self-determined ways. And our favorite at Alia, which is do what love would do. And that means if you're not sure what to do, please do what you would do for someone that you love. It's a framework we use to as a guiding principle to make our decisions. So the UN system is really built in a cohort model. We have been trying this for the last almost 3 years in 5 jurisdictions in 4 states around the country. I'm sorry, in 14 jurisdictions in 5 agencies in 4 states around the country. And every leader had a deputy, so kind of a senior leader and their second, along with a lived experience guide and a professional guide. The lived experience guide would whisper in their ears, that wouldn't work for me and my family, or think about it a different way. And a professional guide can say, I've seen someone else do that, and this is what worked or didn't work. And so that group of 20 people, the 10 guides and the 10 leaders, came together every single month for a year, then every other month, and worked together to develop a proof of concept that we could change the system in the current design constraints. So yes, it would be great if federal funding stopped being accessible largely only when we separated families. And it would be great if there were strong prevention funding or services available. However, there is work that we can do now inside the existing system to get better outcomes. In the first year of this group's work, with no new money and no new laws, no new resources, they were able to reduce foster care placements by 12% across the board and residential placements by 37% across the board. Some of the great outcomes were in the Eastern Service Region of Iowa. Everybody tried different ways of building what might look like an UN system in their area. So Eastern Service Region of Iowa used child safety conferences, and they were able to avoid removal for 94% of the kids referred. In Eau Claire County, they were able to drop the number of youth placed in residential by 40%. In Cass County, North Dakota, they were able to decrease foster care placements with unrelated and unknown people by 43%. In Washington County, Maryland, over 1 year, they were able to drop the child removal rate 61% from 96 to 37. And Waupaca County, Wisconsin, who was very advanced at the time, was able to take the savings they had from getting their residential placements down to 0 to begin to transfer those resources to the front end and hire full-time prevention social workers. All of this was done without compromising safety. We have no indications that children were less safe, and there was no new money, no new policy change. And what we've really learned about systemic change and transformation is you must change people's mindset. So when you change hearts and minds, people act differently. They do different things. So you can change the policy, you can change the procedure, but if they don't believe it, if they don't understand why it's important to do, you will not find people are able to move things. But when their hearts and minds are changed, at every opportunity, they will do what they can to safely preserve families. Here's some of our top 5 learnings. One is that, gosh dang, it's hard work and requires a lot of brave leadership. And so we ask people to really prepare and take care of themselves and their team, because it can be exhausting to push that ball uphill. We also know that we had to start thinking differently about the work, to really think instead about, is this a supply or demand problem? And we don't need to have all the answers, because we can partner with families. They know what they need. So thinking very differently about the work. A really key learning was making the old way harder. Right now, we're in between the old way and the new way. And so the systems are all lined up, the funding, the resource, the roles, the rules to support the old way. And it is really helpful if you can put in place systemic adjustments that make it harder to do things the old way. So I'll give you an example. In Iowa, in order to place a child, they made it so a regional director had to make that decision and come staff that case in person. So they did not want to get people out of bed in the middle of the night to come make that decision, and tried everything they could to safely preserve that family before they got the leadership involved. Number 4 is trust families as the safe bet. Really working with families to dare to share power and to believe in their capacity and in their resilience. And the last one is to expand the group of helpers. This is not work the Child Welfare Agency can do alone. It's not work that a nonprofit can do alone. It requires the collaboration across the judiciary and law enforcement and education and the community and child welfare and housing and economic support, et cetera, coming together with a shared mission to help families remain safely together. Some of our biggest challenges are community resources. In many communities, prevention systems are non-existent or very, very slim because they're not funded. There isn't, funding necessary tied to those services. So they are oftentimes much less than what is the need is. Working in many communities, we found challenges with race equity, disproportionate removals, disproportionate law enforcement response, disproportionate resources, and that continues to be a challenge in the systems in which we work. There was a lot of community pushback, and I'll talk about that a little later on too, but when you start to change things, when you start to move things, there is a pushback, and some of that comes from the community belief about who deserves help and who doesn't, which I'll go back to is often tied and rooted in racism. Capturing consistent data across those 14 jurisdictions, and we don't have really good universal ways of measuring a lot of things we were interested in, is a challenge in our field. And then finding meaningful ways to work with families to have family voice and to share power, but not to burden families or to coerce families, or just finding that right balance of how we co-design with families has been an ongoing way of learning. And helping systems to integrate lived experience voice in meaningful ways has also been challenging. Some of the ways we're leaning in are co-creating new ways of work with the community, with families, really using anti-racism as a forward-facing lens for all that we do. We've had to do some really hard work in supporting change makers. Doing this work requires bravery, and there are people who paid a very strong price, who lost their positions because they were trying to change things and people wanted things to stay the same. Really thinking about developmental evaluation, which is a way you measure innovation. It's how did we get here? So paying attention to the process of what worked. And then we're also using human-centered design, which I talked about and will elaborate on a little bit. The work we're really doing is shifting mindsets. And we know once we have a collective shift in mindset, then the work will change in fundamental ways. But really getting on the same page about what children need to thrive, really understanding that children need an uninterrupted sense of belonging in order to thrive is very important. Chris, you asked about the voice of youth who have experienced the child welfare system. So every jurisdiction had someone with lived experience, many of whom were youth who had grown up in the system. Many of those jurisdictions are working with youth who have grown up in the system, and that is absolutely part of the co-design process that I will talk about in a little bit. And Katie, although I don't have time to read your whole chat right now, I do want to say that I think you are absolutely correct that many of the elements of thinking about new ways of work are very reflective, mirror the ways of working with families and children that are outlined in the Indian Child Welfare Act. And I think that is a really important piece of the work as well. So I think, just understanding there's some really good wisdom there that all families could benefit from is an important insight. So we're really, changing our mindset around what is our work about? Because child welfare was really set up with the idea that we would save children from those bad people, from families who harm them, we would rescue and save children and redistribute them. And really rethinking our purpose fundamentally is a place to start here. So how do we keep children safely with, not from their families? So if our job is totally different, right? It's not how do we rescue children, keep them safe from their families, but what do we need to do to support families to allow children to be safely parented within their families? And hear me say loud and clear that I know enough of this work. After 3 decades, I'm not naive about the fact that sometimes children cannot live immediately safely with their parents. That's true. And the two differences that I'm talking about here are, one, does that mean that they need to go to a home with someone who they don't know, to whom they are not related? Or could they stay in their family? And even a really important aspect of this is, and then what do we do to make it so families can safely parent? If they can't immediately live safely with their parents right now, we punish, shame, blame, and disconnect those parents, and we're done. We move on. And that really does very little to solve the cycle of this problem. They could and do often have other children, but more importantly, they clearly are suffering. And so what is it that we can do to help parents to be able to safely parent? As in many cases, the parents were youth in our system or grew up in a way where their needs were not met, and their parenting reflects their pain-based behaviors. And so what do we need to do, and how might we show up differently with families and parents to allow them to stay safely together? I will tell you something that is coming up really strongly when we start to do real change work. And this is this idea of who is worthy of help. Who is worthy of help? And this has cultural roots in this country. This has historical roots. This has biblical roots around the worthy and unworthy poor. If you're a social worker, you took this in history and systems of social work. Who's worthy of help? And the historical wisdom or roots on this say orphans and widows, right? So because they didn't, and I'm putting this in air quotes, they didn't choose their condition. And you hear people in child welfare all the time talk about, well, they chose drugs over their kids. They chose their boyfriend over their daughter, right? And so early on, we talked about empathy here, and this idea of it is not a natural state to not protect or to harm your children. Something has happened to you to have that state, to have that be the case. And in child welfare, we have attended very deeply to children and not to parents. And there's been a lot of judgment and shame and othering of parents. And I have met plenty of people in child welfare who are not fans of parents, who have a hard time having empathy for parents who have harmed their children. And what I will say to you is that the research is abundantly clear. If you care about children, you must care about their parents. If you care about children, you know that what every child on the face of the earth needs more than anything else in the world is for their parents to be okay. And no amount of services or therapy or substitute caregivers or professionals in their life will help to heal the wound of not having their parents be able to meet their needs. And so our work, what is incumbent upon us in child welfare, is to find ways to have children be able to stay safe and have their needs met by their families, right? And so that means it's a very different shift in our work. It means that we're not just taking children away and meeting their needs, because we will never be able to do so. And despite several decades of trying, it's very clear that children need their people, and they need their community, and they need their people to be okay and to be able to safely care for them. And so we begin asking new questions. We ask questions about what would it take? And I want you to notice it doesn't say, is it possible? Because I'm really done having the discussion about whether or not it's possible. It's been shown to be possible. The question now is, are we willing to do what it will take to keep every child safely at home or safely in their own family, to help families who are struggling, or to ensure that children grow up with an uninterrupted sense of belonging? What would it take to make that happen? And in every case you look at, in every situation in front of you, ask the question, what would it take? Because of course it is possible. And so this changes our role, really, right? We're keeping children safely within their families, while at the same time helping to support parents to be able to safely parent. And that often means that they will need things from us that we have up until now not given them, because it didn't exist, because we didn't think they deserved it, because of our disdain for our, it's kind of a human response. When someone hurts a child, it's very hard to have empathy. And it is, in fact, those people who need our empathy the most. And very likely they were in a situation where they were maltreated as children or did not have their needs met, because that's not a natural state. So really importantly to think about what's next. How in the heck do we do this? Really figuring out, what does it mean to do the work with an anti-racist approach? How do we eliminate racial disparities? And there's a lot of promising practices here that we are trying and having great results with, as are others. Building on bright spots. Who else is doing this well? Who's figured out how to partner with communities and build new ways of work with families, with communities? And we are building a digital home of bright spots. So that'll be coming soon, where the innovations in child welfare that work, as well as the examples of people who have partnered with community and family, will be able to be shared more broadly, so that we can network with people who are getting this right or closer to getting it right. We're doing a whole lot of work on preparing and protecting change makers, because the fact is that when you make real change, people will let you kind of tweak around the edges. But if you go ahead and make real change, that causes others to change, the perception is that if you go away, then my pain of having to do this change will go away. And we've seen lots of really catalytic leaders be set aside or given, their livelihood has been challenged. So really protecting people who are brave enough to say the things that need to be said, to speak truth to power. And that's all of our responsibility. Thinking more about revolutionary change. I've just had an article in the imprint, but there's another one coming about incremental versus evolutionary change, evolutionary versus revolutionary change. And what does it mean to really be catalytic in this way? Are we solving the right problems, going at them the right way? And do we have to change this slowly? You know, if we can in a year reduce the number of children living in residential in 14 jurisdictions, why can't we do that nationally? Why can't we preserve and strengthen more families more quickly? And one way to do that is through family and community co-design. So what I mean by family and community co-design is not family voice. It is not youth voice. It is not, we created a table and we left a seat for you at it. It is a deep and true partnering with families, a deep and true partnering in communities where we believe at our core that those closest to the challenges are also closest to the solutions. And we work together side by side to build the solutions necessary in order to keep families safely together. And that is going to mean things like partnering with our housing folks, partnering with economic support. It's going to mean a lot of different inter-community, interdepartmental collaboration, because this is not only a child welfare challenge. We're currently working with families to put this into practice, to talk with families, to train them to work with other families. So the people who are doing the design work are actually, the designers are families working with families in community, from community, to design those solutions. And so it's a really interesting way of practicing, and you can look forward to a toolkit in just a few weeks here about what conditions must exist in order to do this work in honorable ways. So I have just another quick question for you here, which is, as we're talking about building new ways, to think about what are the old ways and what are the new ways. And I'm wondering about your signs of hope. You know, I had a friend who started signing emails, hope is on the horizon. And I just love that idea. And I do think hope is on the horizon. But I wonder, what are you seeing in your work? Or what are you seeing that are old ways falling away, new ways being started? And what are the signs that you have that we are moving to a new way of work? Are you seeing anything any different? I can tell you some of mine. I'm seeing that people are no longer trying to convince people that change needs to happen. I'm seeing that people are beginning to understand, if you are not doing this work through an anti-racist lens, if you are not doing this work in conjunction and deep and real shared partnership with families, communities, and those with lived experience, that you should not be doing this work. And so the terms of co-design, the terms of lived experience, the terms of power sharing, the terms of anti-racism are infiltrating into our work in really important ways and are shaping the way we do our work. So I feel very hopeful about what is happening. Just a few quick slides here on other reasons I'm hopeful, and some frameworks here about change. Things have to end before they begin. William Bridges' model of transition. So we are in a place of the neutral zone right now in child welfare. We know what we can't do anymore. That has to stop, right? And we're sitting in the neutral zone of what might begin. And we're starting to see inklings of beginning. So the neutral zone can provide some anxiety and unknown and a lack of clarity, but we're starting in beginnings. I think we're crossing over here. We know the new way will consist of equitable approaches. It will consist of power sharing. It will consist of you know, really following the lead of and being in and deep work with people who have lived the system. I think that we're seeing the beginnings of truth and reconciliation, of reparation for the ways that child welfare has been colonized and has acted as a tool of community harm. And so I see those beginning pieces of our work as we move forward. So I'm optimistic there. This here is one of my favorite change slides from my mentor, and Jack, who would say, We used to do things all the old way on the left there. Everything was the old way, and we're trying to go to on the right, all the new way. And what happens is, because we're in child welfare, we can't stop doing it one way. We can't, kind of close down the operation and then build a new, better one. So as we do this, we are building new ways, scaling up new ways at the same time we're scaling down old. And it gets messy in the middle, and that's okay. Right when it feels like, oh my goodness, this is super messy, we should go back to where we knew how to do this work. Remember when it was easy and we knew what we were doing and we didn't have to ask a bunch of other people to join in with us in the work? When you start to feel that way, you're already into the new way. Like things are already past the middle point and we're moving towards a new way of work. And so we are scaling up new ways, building new ways. And equally as important, we're stopping doing things we know cause harm. So it's just as important to start building as it is to stop doing. And then just to say a moment about the immune response of a system. So change can sort of be seen as an invader. And what happens is, I have watched this over and over, is people start to feel a shame response. So what you're saying is what I'm doing or what I've done, has been harmful, but I came to help, so that can't be true. And you start to hear people say, it's just fine the way it is. We're just good. We're good people. We didn't do harm, but we've really got to face the harm that we have done through a lens of the harm we have done to families, the harm we have done to children, and the harm that we have done through an anti-racist lens, through a racist lens. And so really thinking about this work in new ways and letting that feeling go of shame so that we're able to move forward together, because that is an enemy of change when we start to feel that way. So I'd love you to just think about this question for a minute. We're going to pull up a Menti word cloud, and I want you to allow yourself to dream for a second. I want you to allow yourself to feel for a second and to really think about this question. What would revolutionary change feel like to families? And if you can pop open your browser on your phone maybe, and go here to look at using this code. This will populate live for us here so we can see what people are saying. But I'd love you to start thinking about this idea of what would revolutionary change feel like to families. Thank you. Whoever did joy. That's a great first word. Hope and relief, serenity and representation, empowerment, love, right? The bigger the word, the more people have said it. So hope and relief and support, right? Look at that. Healing, community, peace, empathy, equality, a deep breath, abolitionist, respect, caring, collaboration. Oh my goodness, these are the best words ever. Acceptance is gaining speed here, right? Support, love, hope, and relief. Trust. Yeah. Some great words. They're moving so fast. Being seen, more family, connectedness, warm, togetherness, strength. I love this word cloud so much. And as I said, the bigger the word, the more it's said. So let's look at our big words. Love and hope. Love and hope. Followed by safety, relief, support, community, and acceptance. And this, friends, is exactly what we are trying to build. Look at those. Look at how that feels. Can you just feel that in your body? How that feels, just a place we want to be together, a future we want to create together. And by and large, the largest words here are love and hope. And and it makes me think about doing what love would do, right? It makes me think about this idea of how do we do what love would do? How do we move ourselves? And we do this together is how we do this. This is absolutely possible. We created the system. We can uncreate the system. We created the rules. We can uncreate them. We have decided to be in this way with community and families. We can decide to be in a new way. And it is really up to us to build that collective way of doing that. And so I'm super excited to take some of your questions. I know they were coming in fast and furious, and it was hard for me to see those in the chat. But Michelle, I'm hoping that you've been paying close attention.
I'm here to help. I'm here to help. And there were great comments. And I so appreciate you taking the time to be with us today. So there's too many. We won't be able to do all of them, but let me just start by a few folks wanted to hear your comments about youth voice involved in this effort and how you're encouraging child welfare systems to engage with youth with lived experience and so on. If you could comment on that a little bit.
Yes, absolutely. And so, you know, youth voice and folks with lived experience, both on the parent side and the youth side. I mean, I think there's important place here, but I've really I'm really moving to a place of co-creation. So youth co-design, family co-design, beyond youth voice. So I think traditionally we have thought that if we had a youth advisory committee or if we had a youth seat on our, you know, team, that would do it. And then we've included the youth voice, right? And so I really encourage us all to be thinking beyond youth voice and really thinking about sharing power with youth and sharing power with families and co-creating with youth and with families. And so when I say co-creating, what I mean is it's not that there is a youth at the table and 9 other professional voices, and thank you so much for your insight and your opinion. It's that all voices hold equal weight and that there are as many youth voices as other voices or more, and that we are really letting them lead the work and lead what we need to do, both families and youth, and really in larger community as well. And so it is a time where I think professionals in this work, well-meaning professionals, self-included, it is time for us to identify new ways of working in community with families and with youth, and that where we have tried to be supportive, we have usurped power from people. And so taking a back seat and really doing our work to help make it come to fruition what families and communities and youth are designing and naming. So that's what I would say.
Great. Thank you. Others raised questions about building informal supports in neighborhoods. So really looking for comments from you in terms of families who are in the situation of intergenerational poverty, some severe domestic violence, substance use, and building those informal supports becomes part of this effort, right? Moving upstream. So could you speak to thoughts you have about building those capacities in communities? Yeah.
Yes, for sure. And I'm going to add to that community-based support. So we're working in some systems who are thinking about really radical things. I'll give you an example. And that is that if 80% of the calls that come in are really related to neglect, which is largely poverty and racism, might the public agency, attend to the 20% of the cases that are abuse cases, and the 80% of the calls that come in to be managed by and referred to community. So I know this is a little different than your question. I'll get to that, tie it in.
That's great.
But so community organizations, the public agency would share not only the power in decision making, but the resources and the staffing or people and money, to be explicit, in community-based organizations. Because I was at NCAN a couple of years ago. I'll never forget what somebody on the stage said, which was, when parents call for help, they risk losing what is most precious to them. Like, that can't be. You can't call for help to the people who have the power to remove your children and destroy your family. And that, we talk prevention. That's why people, we get involved so late, is that people are afraid to call for help, because you're not going to call and say, like, I'm drinking too much, communities know what happens when that happens. And so how do we make it safe? And so the question came from someone who asked about informal supports in the community, but there are also formal community-based supports, both and, right? So really strengthening families, building community resilience, making it everybody's job in the community to help support families to be able. Right now, I think people think like it's everybody's job to keep children safe, and so we're calling it all in, and things are happening, but it's got to be everybody's job to keep families intact, families safe. When we understand that what children need most is for their families to be together, our response is different, right? And so the closest I can really link this, an example, is to what's happening in some of the police reform movements. The idea that if there's a dog in the road, you don't need someone with a gun to respond. You need, or community mental health response might be able to take some of those calls that right now are all escalated to the top level and then have some risk with it. And so I think child welfare leaders, the innovative leaders on the front end, are really thinking differently about how the system is structured and what part of this belongs in community.
That's great. Thank you. One other comment that came was from Zachary, and he does not think it's possible to have a productive conversation about improving care and services without addressing the need for application of evidence-based practice with fidelity to said practice across human service sectors. So can you talk a little bit about the role that you see of evidence-based practices and at the level of reform that you're trying to describe to this group?
I'm going to have an unpopular answer here. And I'm especially aware that this is sponsored by a university. So this is going to be my answer here. For practice in our field to enter into the evidence-based, having met the standards of evidence-based practice, can take 10 to 20 years by the time it is applied in the field. Very often cannot be applied in the field with the same constraints and restrictions and the same fidelity due to resourcing and other challenges. We are moving at such a rapid pace that our innovation cannot get into the EBPs fast enough. And so that a tie to strictly evidence-based practice is very problematic for me. What I will say instead is that what we should be doing is evidence-informed practice. So you shouldn't just be willy-nilly, and you need to evaluate as you go and iterate as you go and make adjustments so that we're not doing harm. But very frankly, we know enough to get started in a lot of these areas. So our evidence base is large enough that we know the directions to go. And if we are evaluating along the way, iterating along the way, and building the evidence as we go, we are going to be able to make more change, do more good, more quickly, without harm, than if we rely strictly on the evidence-based practices. And a great example of that is the Family First legislation that required only the application of evidence-based practice in prevention. And very directly, we have very little evidence-based practice in prevention in child welfare. And so the practices that were listed were more about early childhood or, related to other kinds of family support, but not to the amelioration of maltreatment or the stopping of maltreatment. And so we are in a place where we are building evidence as we go. Things are moving quickly. Absolutely evidence-informed practice. Absolutely evaluate, harvest, share, publish as you go. But I will not be a person who believes that we should only be using evidence-based practices. And actually, I think it's dangerous to do so.
Well, to your point, we do not have enough in the field to build the whole system that way. And I don't think academics, even at universities, would say that we do at this
Okay,
point.
good.
So we're okay. But what I would ask you is that, core to your message today, and I know there's a ton of people on this call that are doing wraparound, right? And
Mm-hmm.
so there were a lot of comments about resonating with your message. Um, you really made a call for empathy, right? For really improving the do no harm, help like you would your family member and those you love. So, can you think of suggestions to agency head or others about really kind of measuring that within their own organizations? Are there actual tools that you recommend or ways that you go about ensuring that folks are working towards deepening their connections or improving empathy?
It's a great question. I don't have a great tool applicable in child welfare that measures empathy to recommend. What I will say is that the surest way to build empathy is proximity.
Mm-hmm.
And so what this really means for me is that the work we do must be done in proximity, in
Mm-hmm.
closeness with those who are experiencing challenges. So when we are in our offices thinking about what
Mm-hmm.
folks might need and designing services and programs and then writing grants to fund them and then go and bring those services to families, when we haven't really lived that life, we haven't experienced that problem potentially, and we haven't spent time in proximity to families to understand deeply what they need and would like, then we're going to be challenged to build empathy. So the most important thing I would say is that it makes the argument for co-design. It
Mm-hmm.
makes the argument for people who have lived this experience to be the ones designing solution, because they have lived experience, developed empathy. And so, rather than try to teach empathy to our staff or try to measure if they're being empathetic, what I would say is, are the right people involved in solution development? And are we in proximity with families?
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. We have other folks who've asked, I'll just give you a couple and then you can kind of pick a little more information about Family First and how you think that Family First can support this kind of revolutionary change, as well as, or not, your call, and or where it needs to be improved, which is probably where we stand at the university. And then a little more connecting this to the issues of substance use in our communities and
Yeah.
the struggles we all have with accessibility to services, keeping families together in those systems. So those are kind of the two, and you can decide how you want to get us to a wrap up.
Well, I'm going to answer both. Can I
Great.
do both? Okay.
Yeah, I want you to.
So, family first is a great first step, and I have often been quoted saying that I think the most important thing it did for us was its titling, that it got us all to think family first.
Mm.
And all of us know, everyone in the field would say, even the authors of it would say, it's nowhere near what is needed. It is a good first step. It gets us all thinking about prevention, and that's been its greatest gift to the field, is that it has brought this focus, this laser focus on prevention into our work.
Mm-hmm.
There have to be more things that can be funded through it. There has to be more funding for it, and we really need to dismantle this deep end investment we have made and start to build the front end of services. And that's going to be a really important shift that will happen over time. And I'm hopeful about that happening more in the upcoming time, that we will begin to move our resources. I often describe it as kind of a, if you think about a seesaw, kind of a lever, we have to take from one end to move to the other until we shift the momentum then, so that we have more prevention and have less need. We
Mhm.
absolutely the need for the deeper end services. So that'll happen over time. Not fast enough for me or probably anybody on this call, and certainly not fast enough for our children and our families.
Yeah.
But it's a place to start, and that's important. A really important part of that is I can tie this together, and I have been talking a lot over the last few weeks, well, years, but more the last few weeks too, about if we could really attend to the problem of substance use in our country, I think we would do more for avoiding separations than anything else we could do.
Yeah.
And not only do we have a lack of providers, but in my opinion, which is not, I don't consider myself expert in this area by any mean, but what feels missing to me is the lack of trauma informed substance um, treatment, that the understanding of how our families are in need of the treatment, the intergenerational trauma treatment, which leads in many cases to substance use. And instead of treating it in a punitive way or a judgment, a way with judgment, to really understand it as a numbing response to extraordinary trauma intergenerationally. If we could have a system that didn't rely on where you lived or where you worked or who your health care provider was, but was a more unified, intensive system of trauma-informed substance treatment, I think we could go a really long way to meeting some of our goals to avoid family separation. Um, it's not the area I work in, but I am just, really desperate for someone to take that challenge on and to solve that challenge, and have met with many substance use providers, treatment providers, to see if we can find someone who kind of works in this way, in a holistic way, in a trauma informed way, in a family centered way. And I think it's a great opportunity that has not yet been developed, and we need it. And so, for those of you wondering how to make your mark in the world, take that one on and figure that out, because it would help so many people and so many families.
Yeah. That feels like an open letter to the administration, the new administration, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, as we have transition in government coming up in the next week or so, what are some of your hopes that get accomplished in either improving Family First, or what you want to see the administration take on to really support this effort across our states?
So for sure, broadening and strengthening and deeper funding in Family First, and a broadening of what can be funded would be very important. Um, I really feel like something more fundamental has to happen. And I can list a bunch of things. Like I hope there is more lived experience voice in policy shaping. I hope there's more funding and flexibility in Family First. I hope there is more, attention to substance use as a challenge for families. I hope there are, there's attention to housing and other things that we know. I mean, when we did a project using flexible funding to families to try to preserve families, 95% of it went to housing. I mean, it's just over and over and over. People need housing to be able to stay safely together. But something that is really on my mind is the fundamental shift about the way we have structured and funded our system, in that the vast majority of federal dollars are accessible only after we have separated families. And for the government to, um, detach itself from funding family separation, in many ways, I mean that fundamental shift to really think about funding the support and a sustainability of families rather than the separation of families. I think that could manifest in many different ways, but really loosening that funding so that we're not required to separate children and families in order to get the funding needed to support them.
Yeah. Yeah. I can't see the chat anymore, Amelia, but I'm sure there are many people who are very excited to think about that and to partner. I mean, this has traditionally been a system of care conference, right? Those are our roots 30 years deep. And so the concepts that we're coming together on around family voice and upending the system and moving together as collaborators to really kind of change how all work is done and meet families' needs is exciting. And I'm so grateful that you took the time to be here. I'm going to give you one chance to, what did you not say to people that you, because you ran out of time or whatever? Is there anything else you want to make sure people hear from you before we wrap up?
Well, I think the thing I would say, and I was just scrolling through the chat too, but the thing I would say is don't wait for somebody else to do this.
Mm.
That this is every person on this call has a sphere of influence in which you can make different decisions, in which you can ask different questions, in which you can try new things, in which you can engage families in a deeper level, in which you can, partner with unexpected partners to have accelerated or catalytic results. And I really encourage everyone who's listening to say, there's not somebody who's going to solve this alone. and if you're waiting for somebody else to figure this out, we're going to be, waiting a long time. This is the kind of problem that is so complex that it will require every single one of us bringing our very best to the solution making here, and every single one of us asking questions that are uncomfortable, doing things that feel a little bit risky. So it's really important to all of us feel that personal responsibility, to not complain about what is, but to do things in our sphere of influence to make it better. And that's the way things will get better.
I think your comment too, we might not be done yet. I think your comment too about assuming worth, just that really digging into your gut and looking at families and finding and communities really for some folks that everything has worth, and that the connection to family is so deeply important, and connection to being with neighbors and community that is so deeply important to kids, that it's a first step everyone can take. We are in such a divisive moment in our country right now, but assuming worth, assuming that we don't have to do things the way it's been done before, that we do have the power to change, was really, I think, powerful to hear again. It's something that I hope we challenge ourselves to do at the Institute every day, but it was great to hear you talk about it again. So,
and part of that, I'd say, Michelle, is there's enough. There's enough. And so, we don't have enough people, resource, time, money. Yes, we do. We're just using them in ways that are no longer functional.
Yeah.
And so I think it's really important for us to think about, really carefully evaluating how we are using our funding, our time, our staffing, our resourcing ourselves, our own personal and professional lives and time. Is what we're doing getting us closer to new ways, or helping to hold up an old way that we all know does lifelong predictive harm?
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you, Amelia.
Yes, my pleasure.
All right. So I want to thank Amelia again. I also want to thank all the people who commented and participated. I'm being told that I'm being hard to hear, but I'm sorry about that. I'm going to talk as loud as I can. Truly, I want to thank you all for being the change makers that you are. So the kickoff's not over yet. If you haven't registered for one or two sessions this afternoon, it isn't too late to join us. We have some great opportunities for learning and for dialogue. First, we have a wellness break with our own Dr. Nadine Finnegan-Carr, who's not only a specialist in the area of prevention and adolescent risk at the Institute, but also a yoga instructor. And she's just great. She'll make sure you're all breathing and ready to learn before jumping into your afternoon sessions. So beginning at 3:30, you can join either Rethinking Implicit Bias, Implications for Promoting Equity in Our Communities, or you can join Strengthening Services by Using Evidence and Partnership. I know that both of those are great. They have very strong presenters, and they've carefully prepared for today's session. So I just do want to remind you the second workshop on using evidence is the beginning of a multi-part series on evidence-based practice that ties to the work of Family First and some of the efforts that need to be pulled together in our communities to meet the needs. And the speakers of those sessions will share all the details. So don't forget, today's just the beginning of a 9-month-long series. Please click on our Training Institute Live website, post in the chat, and you can see all the full schedule of dates and workshops. And most importantly today, make sure you're signed up in our conference platform. Once you're signed in, you can access the wellness break and all your sessions of choice today. So all those links are in the sessions are posted in the chat right now. Thank you so much for coming. Enjoy your afternoon, and I look forward to seeing you next month.